This is our 6th year here in the Clouden Family Library of the Alumni Association. I see some people who have been here almost every single year, and I want to thank you for coming. We're glad to have new visitors too. Before we begin with our breakfast, I'd like to honor Agnes Roach and Marianna Tax Choldin, our award winners. So if you will raise a glass with me. Both are graduates of the library school, among other degrees, here at the university. To Marianna Tax Choldin, she's a Public Service Award winner in 2011. And to Agnes Roach, an Alumni Service Award winner this year in 2012. Both visionaries, both talented organizers, both who have brought distinction, credit to the university, and benefit to their communities. Congratulations. Well, I don't like to interrupt a good party, but I would like to introduce our speaker today. It's my privilege to introduce Marianna Tax Choldin. She is a 4-time University of Chicago alumna, graduating from the lab school, the college, a master's in Slavic languages and literature, and a PhD from the Graduate Library School. Her dissertation for the Graduate Library School set her on a path specializing on censorship in Russia, the Soviet Union, and beyond. Respected for her teaching, research, and service in international affairs and library matters, Marianna joined the faculty of the University of Illinois in the Slavic and East European Library in 1969. In her professional life, she has dedicated herself to the freedom of inquiry, connecting scholars with information and scholars with each other. The roots of Marianna's commitment run deep, having seen her father, the renowned Chicago anthropologist Saul Tax, bring together a global community of researchers to help solve social problems. Marianna was inspired to do the same thing with librarians. Meeting with colleagues from around the globe, she formed panels, presented conferences, an international conference of Soviet, Slavic, and East European studies. As the Cold War ended and contact between former Soviet librarians and the West became easier and more frequent, Choldin worked to promote openness between libraries and connect Slavic librarians from around the world, for which she was awarded the Pushkin Gold Medal in 1990, a very special honor from the Russian President's Commission on Culture. At the University of Illinois at Urbana Champaign, Choldin helped to found the Summer Research Laboratory on Russia and Eastern Europe, now the place to be for researchers. As founding director of the Mortensen Center for International Library Programs from 1991 to 2002, she brought more than 600 librarians from 76 countries to Urbana Champaign. Marianna also chaired the library program of the Soros Foundation, which has distributed millions of dollars to libraries and librarians in more than 30 nations. She has traveled throughout the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Central America, South Africa, and Asia, giving presentations on censorship issues and speaking with librarians, writers, journalists, government officials, and ordinary folks of all ages about information on a global scale. Ms. Choldin's numerous books and articles include A Fence Around the Empire, Russian Censorship of Western Ideas Under the Tsar, 1985, and The Red Pencil, Artists, Scholars, and Censors in the U.S., co-edited with Maurice Friedberg in 1989. So I present you Marianna Tax Choldin.
I have to apologize first for my voice. I was stricken with laryngitis at just the wrong time a few days ago, and I'm dealing with that more or less. And I also had a cataract removed very recently from this eye, which is great, but my eyes are just learning how to work together again, and my little glasses from the drugstore are helping me, bailing me out at the moment. So I will do my best. If I have to stop and drink some water or put in a cough drop, you will, I hope, understand. I also wanted to say that I'm right at home here, literally. I was born and raised on this campus and spent the years from 11 to 20 living 3 houses up the block on Woodlawn. So this was a fraternity house. We never paid any attention to that at the time, but it's nicer that it's alumni house now. I want to talk a little bit about Russian writers and censors and Russian writers as censors. And I'll tell you how I got started on that. A few weeks ago, very recently, I stumbled upon my winter quarter paper for Russian Civ, dated March 1962, which, as you know, is 50 years ago. So this is one of my 50th reunions. I have another one next year because I entered with the class of 63, but I graduated in the class of 62. So I'm very happy that I found it. I had been, just to give you a little background, I'd been head over heels in love with Russian literature since I was 14, when a visiting Soviet anthropologist, a colleague of my father's, came upon me reading an abridged translation of War and Peace, and took me pretty severely to task for that. I vowed then, because he really scared me, that I would learn Russian, and 3 years later I entered the college and began to do just that, a process that continues today. You never stop learning Russian. Back in 1962, I was fascinated by a 19th century literary and political phenomenon known as the superfluous man, which was the subject of this paper. The most superfluous of superfluous men is a character named Oblomov. And he is the hero, if you can call him that, of a novel by Ivan Goncharov called Oblomov. And I'd like at this point to make a little survey. I know that 2 people in this room at least will get this right. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Goncharov. Oh, good. This is much better than the usual when I ask about that. How about Oblomov? Who's heard of Oblomov? Yeah, same hands go up. But that's great. I am delighted. Those of you who haven't heard of it or haven't read it should read it. This is my old Penguin edition, which was translated by David Magarshak, who did a lot of good translations in those years. And here is a charming new translation. This is actually the Regenstein copy of it by Stephen Pearl that came out just in 2006. And in fact, there was another translation of Oblomov within a couple years after that, I think. I don't know why Oblomov suddenly became so popular, but he's definitely worth reading. So I would be happy if somebody wants to, if we want to pass these around and have a look at Oblomov, just feel free. Oblomov is famous for lying on his divan all day. And he did this every day, while Russia, propelled by more energetic folks, is lurching toward revolution. Oblomovshchina, or Oblomovism, was a hot topic in the 1860s. The novel had been published in 1959. And the book engaged and infuriated Russian intellectuals and spawned numerous works of criticism. And it's a darn good story. I really do recommend it highly. When I came upon Oblomov in 1962, I had no idea that his author, Goncharov, would be important to me one day in a different context altogether. Here's how it happened. In 1976, when I was well into my career as a Slavic librarian at the University of Illinois in Urbana, I took leave and spent the academic year back up here working on my PhD. A colleague at Illinois had shown me an innocuous-seeming little bibliography published in the mid-19th century, listing publications in French, German, and English that had been banned by an imperial Russian governmental body called the Committee on Foreign Censorship. From earliest childhood, I'd been against censorship, and I took freedom of expression for granted. I guess I'm a genuine product of the liberal cocoon that was Hyde Park in the 40s and 50s. And so the moment I saw that bibliography, I was hooked. I set out to learn what that committee was all about, and the result was my dissertation. And eventually the dissertation became this book called A Fence Around the Empire, Joan mentioned it, Russian Censorship of Western Ideas Under the Tsars. And if anybody wants to look at that, you can look at that, and I want to point out that there's also a copy of that and another of my books, as well as my husband Harvey's books, back there on those bookshelves. And all alumni are encouraged to give a copy of their books. If you didn't know that, you should hurry up and get a copy of your book here to swell these bookshelves, because it's a really lovely collection. That bibliography turned out to be an amazing entree to a place unlike any I had known. An official record of decisions made by the committee, it contained, in alphabetical order, entries for items I never would have imagined to be lined up together. Not only obvious things like treatises by political philosophers, Karl Marx among them, but also single issues of ladies' magazines, anatomy textbooks, Roman Catholic catechisms, world histories, travel memoirs, cookbooks, and much more. In each case, the reader's attention was directed to particular pages, lines, even individual words that were to be excised before the work would be permitted for Russian citizens. Or a book might be banned completely, or it might be banned for the public, but permitted for doctors or for Protestants. Reading these lists, I felt that I'd stepped through the looking glass. The Red Queen might appear at any moment and call out, "Off with her head." When, in the course of my research, I came to examine some of these banned passages, I began to understand what the censors were looking for. Disrespect for royalty, especially but not only Russian royalty, criticism of the institution of autocracy, mention of sex and lack of reverence for religion, and finally, describing Russians as what I have come to call non-European barbarians. These themes appeared everywhere in all sorts of foreign publications, from a poem in a fashion magazine to a line in an encyclopedia article. I learned that the Foreign Censorship Committee employed armies of clerks to apply thick black ink to offending passages, called in their jargon, covering over with caviar, or scraped words off the page with razors, or pasted pieces of scrap paper over unwelcome paragraphs. And, it's hard to imagine. I have a couple things I can pass around to you, and I'll tell you how I came to see them, because that's a really interesting story. But if you look at this very nicely made color Xerox, on the page it isn't really this yellow, of a volume of the Brockhaus Encyclopedia, 13th edition, published in 1885, that I found on the shelf in Urbana, and I'll come to that in a moment, you'll see a place in an article on Nicholas, one of the Nicholases, one of the royal family of Russia, that just isn't there. It's scraped off, and I'll be talking about that. And there are also, you can see examples. I have an example here on the cover of an exhibit that I curated at the New York Public Library, and then we remounted it in Urbana. This was a picture, I'll pass these around, of Empress Elizabeth I, and the text said some uncomplimentary things about her. So they simply inked out the offending passage and covered it over as well with scrap paper. So these were techniques that I will tell you a little bit more about. And who were these censors? Who were the people doing this job? I began to build lists of names culled from documents published archival materials that I found in my two main libraries, Chicago's and Urbana's, and to dig around and learn more about these mostly men, although I did learn about one interesting woman, but that's another story. Since 1991 and the end of the Soviet Union, Russian scholars have been having fun in Soviet archives, finding all kinds of information about imperial censors. But in the late 70s, when I was working on this topic, it was absolutely forbidden territory. Russian colleagues looked at me in disbelief when I told them standing safely outdoors where no one might hear us, that I was working on censorship. "Why that?" one friend cried. "I won't be able to help you at all." Luckily, I found lots of material in published form located in libraries outside the Soviet Union, and I was able to put together stories that my Soviet colleagues couldn't dream of until much later. I learned that the lower-level censors and the clerks who implemented the decisions applied the caviar, pasted on the paper scraps, wielded the razors. They were mostly a mix of native speakers of foreign languages living in the empire, Balts, Jews, Germans, and others, as well as Russians who knew foreign languages. As you might imagine, they were an interesting and sometimes colorful bunch, and I would love to have been a fly on the wall in their workplace, the committee offices in St. Petersburg, the imperial capital, Moscow, Odessa, and various border cities. In recent years, Russian scholars have been focusing their research on who the censors were, and there is now much more information than I had access to while working on my dissertation and book. The censors who really attracted my attention were the big cheeses, the chairman of the committee in St. Petersburg, the senior censors, because they turned out to be some of Russia's top writers and poets. While it's not unique to see such brilliant writers and thinkers in this role, both Humboldt and Goethe served as censors in German states, it's still quite striking in imperial Russia, especially when contrasted with Soviet times, but that's another story that I won't have time to talk about today. Three of Russia's greatest poets, Fyodor Tyutchev, Apollon Maikov, and Yakov Polonsky, served the committee over many years. I realize these names may not be any more familiar to you than Goncharov, but trust me, they are really important. What a shame that poetry is so devilishly hard to translate. And this is where we return to Goncharov, the author who created Oblomov. He served not as a censor of foreign publications, but in our committee's sister office, where items to be published within the empire were reviewed. I haven't studied this side of the operation very much, and I came upon Goncharov in this capacity by accident as I was tracking down my foreign censors. I found a wonderful quote from Goncharov that I used in my book, a delicious harangue about a censor's job. Goncharov had been arguing with Turgenev, whose work he censored from time to time. According to Goncharov, Turgenev attacked him for his censorship activities. Goncharov threw Maikov and Polonsky in Turgenev's face. Why not attack them too? After all, they were also censors. Someone present remarked that Maikov and Polonsky worked in the foreign censorship, and Goncharov responded angrily. "Well, yes, foreign, but censorship all the same. What's the difference?" shouted Goncharov. "It's true that they didn't do anything, while I worked night and day. It's true that I worked in the general censorship. And do you know how I earned my reputation as a strict censor? By battling against stupidity. I let through the clever authors without argument, but I saw to it that the road to literature was closed to fools. Yes, I myself am against censorship. I'm not an advocate of arbitrary rule. I am a literary man pur sang, but one must protect literature against the invasion of stupidity," end quote. The St. Petersburg Foreign Censorship Committee met every Wednesday afternoon, and the meetings sound really delightful, perhaps like one of our most beloved classes in the college in 1962. Here's a reminiscence by Maikov of a typical meeting under Tyutchev's chairmanship. Tyutchev always told us something interesting in connection with some new foreign book. He would remember an historical case, an anecdote, an event from diplomatic life, something from the reservoir of his impressions, and all of this cleverly, wittily. And of Maikov's chairmanship, one of his censors wrote, "He himself, Maikov, always told us a mass of interesting rumors, facts, anecdotes on the subject of politics, literature, and social life. Then we began with the reports. There was no scientific, literary, or artistic question which Mykov did not elucidate with a whole series of interesting commentaries of the most varied kinds. Possessed of an excellent memory and following the development of religious, philosophical, historical, political, literary, and artistic questions in the West, Mykov always discovered in himself a whole arsenal of facts with which he explained or enriched the material in the reports. I may say with confidence that our Wednesdays were our academy, where we enhanced our knowledge and broadened our intellectual horizons. Sounds just like the University of Chicago, doesn't it? I think so. I went back to find my old Russian Civ essay because I was anticipating going to a conference on Goncharov later this month. As it happens, I'm not participating, but I'm delighted to have come back to Goncharov and his eminent colleagues because I've been giving a lot of thought to those imperial-era writer censors and to their Soviet successors, while working on a memoir about Russia, censorship, and me over the last 50 years. In the memoir, I describe how I myself experienced censorship while studying it, and how I developed an uncomfortably intimate relationship with the censors. I'd like to spend my last few minutes with you reading a little from my unfinished memoir. I'll concentrate on my experiences with imperial censorship and leave the Soviet material for discussion later if you're interested and we have time. Here I'm talking about how I began searching for examples of what the censors were looking for, that is, those items that were indicated in the bibliography. And here's what I wrote about it. I need to describe exactly what I'm looking for. My catalog, prepared by the Foreign Censorship Committee, gives me a good bibliographic description of the volume I'm searching for, world history perhaps, or a volume of an encyclopedia, or an issue of a ladies' magazine. Below the entry is an instruction to the censors. Look at page 27 and delete lines 12 through 18 from the bottom, or delete chapter 6, or delete certain words in line 20, or ban the entire book, or permit the book, but only for a restricted category of readers, as I mentioned before, doctors or Protestants, for example. The instructions are explicit and clear. If I can find the book or see a photocopy at least of the pages indicated, I'll be able to read for myself exactly what concerned the imperial censors. And in nearly 300 cases, I was able to do just that. So here's what happens one fine day when I enter the stacks, this time in Urbana, list in hand, just another day of collecting data. I've learned from the card catalog that Illinois owns the editions I seek of a particular world history and of the Brockhaus Encyclopedia, the one you've looked at. The world history was in German as well. Of course, I'm interested only in the exact edition listed in the catalog because the page and line numbers have to correspond in order for me to find the passage I'm seeking. I find the encyclopedia first. You have a copy. I pull the indicated volume off the shelf, and I turn to the indicated page. The instructions lead me to the article on one of the Russian royals, and when I find the indicated lines, they are gone. I shake my head. There must be some mistake. I blink a few times and look again and realize that someone has scraped those lines off the paper, perhaps with a razor. Well, I think this is certainly strange. And I decide to look for the next item in another volume of the same edition of the encyclopedia. I find it, turn to the right page, and gasp. The lines I need have been covered over with black ink. Bringing the volumes with me, I search out the history book, and to my horror, I find the same kinds of desecration on the pages I need, and even a new method of deletion. Some passages have pieces of scrap paper pasted over them, like Elizabeth there that you're looking at. Forgive me if I sound like a character from Poe when I say, dear reader, that it is difficult for me to describe for you my feelings at that moment. I sense a chill of unease, even fear, I look over my shoulder. Someone had been here before me and excised those passages, and not only from the encyclopedia. Whoever it was got to the history book before me, too. I grab those volumes and run out of the stacks, not something scholars usually do, straight to the library administrative offices. I find my colleague who's in charge of collections, and together we do a little research in the files. These volumes, along with a number of others, have come into the university library in the personal collection of a Russian émigré scholar, Simon Littman, early in the 20th century. Professor Littman, by the way, the first Jewish faculty member at the University of Illinois, brought with him from Odessa his father's library. These volumes have passed through the Odessa branch of the Foreign Censorship Committee, and they bear the stamp of the Odessa branch of the Foreign Censorship Committee. I'm very moved by this discovery and unsettled. I'm too surprised to see that I'm trembling. This is my closest encounter yet with a real Russian censor. I'm beginning to realize that I have my own internal Russian censor, and he and I are spending a lot of time together in my fourth floor study. I had a beautiful study on the fourth floor of the library. I'm afraid of him, but I need him to help me with my research. He seems to be a kind of minor league Dybbuk, probably a minor league censor in his time, a displaced soul who is lodged with me. But now, with the discovery of these volumes, my censor and I are in the process of this genuine expert, my model, so to speak. I hold in my hands 2 volumes that this real censor has handled, not today, not in my stacks, and certainly not with me in mind, but here they are, testimony to the successful mechanics of imperial Russian censorship. By this time, I've accumulated a pile of photocopies of censored passages, and I'm beginning to grasp the themes and the concerns of the censors. For these 2 volumes, I will have to search in other libraries and request photocopies so I can examine the passages that had been so artfully and effectively excised from my copies with thick black ink, with razors, with paste and scrap paper. In that instant in the library office, I realized that these books and I are victims together. Their pages have been defaced, and I have been deprived of the ability and the right to read those passages. The whole process has suddenly come vividly to life. From this moment on, with the help of my internal censor, I really begin to think like a censor, and simultaneously, I think like someone who has been censored. As I sit alone in my study, poring over my passages, and as the patterns begin to emerge, I find myself exclaiming, "Ah, that sentence certainly has to go." Why? Because it's disrespectful toward Russian royalty, or questions the Tsar's power, or ridicules religion, or portrays Russians as non-European barbarians. And then I think of the reader, perhaps an academic like myself, and I feel his or her frustration and rage upon confronting that defaced page. So that's the end of my quote from the memoir. So there I sat in my study in Urbana on the 4th floor of the library in the late 70s, working on my dissertation. I was leading a double life at that time as a tenured faculty member in Urbana and as a doctoral student here at the U of C in the Graduate Library School. I loved my work as a Slavic librarian, and I loved my scholarship. Today, I find myself looking back 50 years at that Russian Civ paper, thinking about Oblomov, and feeling grateful to the college for propelling me on my way. Thank you. So I'm sure we have some time, for any comments or questions or anything I can clarify. Yeah, Peggy?
I guess I'm surprised that, or maybe the Russians also did this, that they didn't censor things at the point of publication.
They did.
Yeah.
They did, but not foreign books. See, a book that was published in Germany or England, I was focusing on that because I figured that from looking at books that hadn't been written for the Russian audience and had been published outside, I'd be able to tell what they were after. But they did. They had this whole committee that Goncharov worked for that censored left and right things prior to publication. Absolutely.
Are there some things that can't be found, where they really managed to stop the information?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. You find out about those in archives later, or in the case of the foreign books, often they got sent back to Germany or to the publisher, to England, to wherever. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so taken by that exchange between Goncharov and Turgenev. And Goncharov's, it sounds so much like a rationalization. Well, I censor, but I use it for something good, which is to guard literature from stupidity. And I just wondered if you had any idea whether Goncharov took the censorship job for the money, or was there some kind of political pressure, which I wouldn't think there was, but maybe there was. And why did he do
I
that?
think he did it. I've read just a little about it, and I'm thinking of looking further now that I have gotten back into it thanks to my term paper. I think he had joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I think it was. No, I'm not sure which ministry it was. He had joined a ministry, become a civil servant a few years earlier. And that was a nice, secure job. You're a writer or you're a poet. How do you keep yourself alive today or then? You get a civil service job or some kind of job that you can do during the day, and then you can go home and write. And I suspect that that's why he did it. He certainly was not interested in the level of activity that the censors had to do. The poets that I mentioned who were active in the foreign censorship, in my mind, there's no question why they did it. They had access, immediate access, to all foreign works. It was fabulous for them. What a break, They came right to them and they could deal with it. Yeah.
As you were speaking, I couldn't help recalling my first and only first-hand experience with Russian censorship. I was a student at the Institute of International Studies in Geneva, and I went there in 1956, and the librarian was crowing about the fact that she had just received a notice from the Soviet government, I guess a publication organization, to remove all the pages related to Stalin from the Soviet encyclopedia.
Exactly.
I consider that the highest form of chutzpah I've ever heard.
Well, it was routine. Judy.
Well, thank you very much for this wonderful, wonderful presentation. I am Judy Nadler, I'm the director of the library. I actually have been both a victim, or whatever you call it, of censorship, and a censor myself. In a generation, later than the one you described, as a student in Romania under Soviet regime. There, we actually, I had a student job, and there the attention was primarily on political figures that fell from grace. We said Stalin. This was, during the Stalin regime, so others, not Stalin himself. And we had, our job was to go to all the dictionaries, the encyclopedias, the history books, in all the departmental libraries, and outline that in black. And then there was somebody else coming to check whether that was done. And if in one book it was not, obliterated well enough, then we were in trouble. So therefore we were
You did a good job.
And it was so far so that there was a saying during those times that in Russia nothing is as hard to predict as the past. Yes. That is actually very true, because the past was changing, as we speak. Thank you. To me, this book's
You remembered your days as a censor. Before I answer, let me just say one thing about that order that came through. In Urbana, we had a copy, as does Chicago and as do most great libraries, of the third edition of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, the Bolshaya Sovetskaya Encyclopedia, which was done in Stalin's time. and toward the end of Stalin's time. So there were a lot of, history was changing a lot, as Judy said. And one day, the library in Urbana received an order from their Soviet agent, as did Chicago, and it did every other library that had it, to go to the volume that had the article on Beria, who was Stalin's great henchman, and they told you exactly how to cut out the pages with a razor blade, and they sent you, very kindly, an article on the Bering Strait to affix, have it bound in. Well, the library in Urbana had 2 copies of the encyclopedia, and neither of them had been fixed already. I mean, they fixed them as fast as they could before, during publication if they could, but if not, they sent the subscribers these notices. And we simply tipped into the binding all of this material. So you have the article on Beria, you have the Bering Strait, and you have the instruction. But this happened all the time, and my Russian friends tell me that if at home they had an edition of that encyclopedia, some people felt very brave and didn't do it, but others, because you were waiting for a knock on the door, and if you had the knock on the door, they would look at your books page by page, and it was all evidence against you. So plenty of people, individuals, did do it, make these changes within the country. But out here, who was going to stop us, So we didn't have to do it. Yes.
I was going to say, I had a friend who worked in the Latvian State Library in the 1970s before she emigrated, and she said they got regular packets from Moscow of pages that needed to be cut out of books with razor blades and sent back. And it was simply the politicians who were in and out of power.
Exactly.
And photographs. And she said, and then they had to send them all back to prove that it had been done and paste in the new pages.
Yeah.
And she actually thought it was an incredible waste of time because actually
Nobody cared anyway.
cared. And I guess my question is, does this still go on there, or is it more or less? Is it much freer?
It's infinitely freer now, that's for sure. I mean, the Stalin period was the worst, but that's a very complex question because it depends on what time you're talking about. When Glasnost first began under Gorbachev, the libraries were hit very quickly with instructions from above to open the closed collections. And I was in Moscow very frequently during those years, and every time I would go to a library, I would see the same exhibit in the main hall of the library. Treasures from the Spetskhan, from the special closed collection, because they'd all been essentially instructed to do this because we were having Glasnost now. We were having, openness and freedom of expression. When Yeltsin came in after the Soviet Union officially fell, it was so much freer in those early years, in the early 90s, They opened all kinds of archives that some of which have since been closed again, But there were just every kind of manifestation of openness. The censorship, I actually had the pleasure of meeting one of the chief censors, and he confirmed that this wasn't going on anymore. Lately, it's not so easy to guess exactly what's happening because Putin, as you know, is a KGB officer. He was trained and worked all his career in the KGB, and it was the KGB that handled censorship for the Central Committee of the Soviet Union, which had this policy that there was no acknowledged censorship in the Soviet Union. There was no censorship in the Soviet Union. That was a bourgeois phenomenon. Of course, there was total censorship of a very compelling kind, but it wasn't acknowledged. So you didn't have the censorship committee in the same way. But once the archives opened and once former censors were free to talk, which they did a lot, you learned about all the things that were done, and even the books of instructions that they had, which they jokingly referred to as the Talmud, the rule books of behavior. But what's exactly going on today? It's much harder to say. Putin and his organization have managed to clamp down on the national media, television particularly, and some of the papers, but they haven't had much effect on plenty of other things, including a very powerful radio station in Moscow, that Echo Moskvy, that broadcasts everywhere. And it's clearly not a Soviet phenomenon anymore. But I think, as I say, some archives have closed again, and it's probably not as easy to work on certain topics as it used to be. That's what happens. Yeah. Yes.
Did the censorship extend to technical journals too that might come into Russia, like things from the West, like on biology, chemistry, physics, whatever? Are they subject to editing too?
Especially during the worst times. Biology, this was the era of, yes. And so biology was very heavily controlled. So were during the worst of it in Stalin's time, so was just about everything you can imagine. Just about everything you can imagine. And this was true in Judy's former homeland and in all the countries. I was in Albania giving some seminars on this subject in 93, I think. And I was in the public library in one of the provincial, if you can call it, small cities with sheep and shepherds on the main street and so on. It was a charming place and a nice public library. One of the librarians took me on a tour of the stacks, and she showed me a tower of books that went from floor to ceiling, leaning against a window. And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "Well, these are all books from the Hoxha era." He was the dictator of Albania, and as crazy as they come and as brutal as they come. And they were books on, she showed me, they were on every imaginable topic and every type. She said, "These books are totally worthless because they were doctored so much." And I said, "Well, I hope somebody's keeping a copy of every one." And she said, "Yes, the National Library is keeping a copy of every one of these books, but we don't have room on the shelves to keep this kind of stuff, So it depends on the time. Yeah.
In all through history, has anybody ever kept a document that shows, which countries had rulers during certain ages that doctored up their literature? Or is there anything today, an organization that will publish or that recognizes that these things, maybe they were published, but if you're going to read them, beware because they're on this list?
That's a complicated question. I think there are a lot of researchers now in many of the countries where these things happened. And I have no doubt that if North Korea ever gets, liberated to the point where researchers can look at their things, they'll be working on this too. So in individual countries, it's something that scholars are doing. It's not at all unusual. I mean, countries that had or have censorship, this is what they do. And they're always doing it to protect the public against the evils of ideas, whatever it may be. We have impulses here in this direction too. It's not coming from the top, it's coming from bubbling up from various interest groups in our country who think that, books that talk about gays and lesbians and are in school libraries are dangerous and shouldn't be there. We Americans, especially librarians, have ample experience with this sort of thing. It seems to be a sort of a human instinct, but equally strong as the human instinct for freedom of expression. So, the two are going hand in hand. But there are projects. There was a wonderful journal that was sort of a Bible for me. I don't think they're publishing as a journal anymore. They've got a website, Index on Censorship, which some of you may know. The library here has a complete run of the published volumes of Index on Censorship. Index on Censorship was not so much into the past as into what was going on right now. And every issue, they had wonderful articles on what was going on in this country or that country, but then in the middle of the issue was a section, usually in a different color paper, called Index, that went alphabetically, country by country, saying what had gone on in terms of censorship in the last 3 months or 4 months since the last issue. So there are organizations, civil society kinds of organizations, that try to keep track of these things. But it's so vast. And in so many countries, you had censorship of one kind or another. It would be an enormous global project to try to put together things like this.
I was wondering, is there censorship on the internet today?
Oh, yes. Yeah, there are a lot of attempts. Well, China is probably the best example, but not only China, some of the Arab countries. In Russia, not successfully to my knowledge. It turns out to be extremely difficult, but there are attempts in Russia, as well as other places. Yeah.
On what period of time did you focus your research?
Well, my first, the Fence Around the Empire was sort of late 18th century up to the Revolution. And then I began to work on the Soviet period.
The reason I'm asking is I recently completed the new book out on Catherine the Great, and one of the things that stood out for me is how widely she read.
Yes, nobody censored Catherine. She was the one overseeing censorship. There was plenty of censorship under Catherine. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Time for one more question.
Or not?
Well, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.